Greetings, my fellow night owl history enthusiasts. As we prepare to traverse the fog-draped highlands and crumbling stone fortresses of ancient Scotland, I'd love to hear, where are you joining from tonight? Drop a comment below sharing your location and current time, whether you're settling into evening in London or greeting the dawn in Sydney. Your presence enriches our journey. If these winding explorations of bygone eras resonate with you, don't forget to subscribe so you'll never miss our historical adventures. Now, get cozy, relax, and let your imagination wander with me to a realm of breathtaking landscapes and unrelenting harshness, where the haunting drone of bagpipes echoes through glens and the clang of broadswords rings from rocky peaks. The Scotland we cherish today, with its warm hospitality, inviting taverns, and magical scenery, masks a turbulent past of relentless struggle that would challenge even the hardiest souls. While Hollywood paints the Middle Ages with romantic brushes of noble knights and merry adventures, Scottish reality was etched in clan warfare, English invasions, ecclesiastical oppression, and the ever-looming shadows of starvation and pestilence. Existence was brief, merciless, and frequently savage for most, whether they were dirt-poor peasants laboring in fields or warriors caught in the power plays between chieftains and monarchs. In the peaceful moments before sleep claims you, we'll strip away the glossy veneer of songs and legends to reveal the authentic experience of living, loving, and battling during these chaotic centuries. Together we'll encounter formidable fighters and devout queens, walk alongside common folk scraping survival from unforgiving soil, and witness the birth of Scotland's defiant spirit amid constant upheaval. But first, let's paint the backdrop. Picture an untamed wilderness where morning mist clings stubbornly to locked surfaces while winds murmur through purple heather. Towering highlands stand like ancient sentinels, their summits veiled in clouds, valleys carved by rushing burns. The lowlands unfold in gentle slopes, giving way to patchwork farmlands dotted with humble villages clustered around simple stone churches. Crisp, peat-scented air carries whispers of wilderness. Dense Scots pine and oak forests sheltering red deer and wild boars while golden eagles circle overhead with piercing cries. When night falls, the heavens blaze with undimmed stellar glory, unpolluted by modern lights. Yet beneath this raw beauty lurked perpetual danger. Rival clans plotted ambushes and vengeance. Nobles conspired for land and influence. And always, the ominous threat of English invasion loomed from the south. For ordinary folk, each day brought fresh battles against nature's wrath, deadly sickness, and the arbitrary whims of their overlords. They found fleeting comfort in seasonal rhythms, family and clan bonds, and the rigid doctrines of their faith. This is the stage where Scotland's story unfolded, a saga of perseverance, belief, and the indomitable will of a people destined to survive centuries of adversity. As we navigate these turbulent times together, we'll meet monarchs and laborers, saints and scoundrels, champions and villains, all playing their roles in Scotland's grand historical drama. But for now, let the echoes of the past fade as sleep approaches. The whispering leaves of ancient forests, the contented lowing of cattle in pastures, the faint plucking of a minstrel's lute. May these become your lullaby as we prepare to immerse ourselves in medieval Scotland. Rest well, time-weary traveler, for tomorrow our tale begins in earnest. In that distant era, Scotland was a mosaic of fiercely autonomous clans, each fanatically devoted to kin and perpetually prepared to defend honor or seize territory from neighbors. The clan system formed the very spine of Scottish society, providing identity, security, and belonging in a world where centralized law remained fragile at best. At each clan's helm stood the chief, a figure commanding both reverence and terror from his people. Equal parts military commander, magistrate, and patriarchal leader, the chief bore responsibility for his clan's welfare and defense. He mediated disputes, delivered justice, and led warriors against rival clans or foreign aggressors. Clan allegiance trumped even loyalty to the crown in regions where royal authority was weak or disputed. A man's sworn word was his bond. To break an oath or betray one's clan meant enduring disgrace, banishment, or execution. Yet this intense clan loyalty carried a dark counterpart, fueling generations-long cycles of retaliatory violence. A perceived insult, stolen cattle, or contested land could ignite blood feuds claiming countless lives on all sides. Among the most infamous was the centuries-long vendetta between Western Scotland's two mightiest families, Clan Campbell and Clan MacDonald. Their poisonous rivalry began in the early 1300s when Robert the Bruce rewarded Campbell loyalty during the Wars of Independence with lands in Argyll that the MacDonalds considered ancestral territory. This perceived injustice festered into generations of brutal warfare. Villages burned, rivals slaughtered, retaliatory strikes escalating in savagery. The 1646 Glencoe massacre marked its nadir when Campbell forces slaughtered dozens of sleeping MacDonalds under government orders, an atrocity that permanently stained Campbell honor while cementing MacDonald hatred. This massacre also revealed how external powers manipulated clan rivalries. In this case, the English government exploiting Highland divisions to weaken Scottish resistance. For ordinary folk caught in these feuds, survival remained precarious. At any moment, rival clans might descend to torch crops, steal livestock, and leave carnage in their wake. Families lived in perpetual anxiety, never knowing when they'd be summoned to defend clan honor with their lives. Yet despite this constant peril, the clan system offered something priceless in such uncertain times: profound identity and belonging. To be part of a clan meant having an immutable place in the world, a family that would fight for you, and a heritage stretching back through time's mists. This fierce clan loyalty would profoundly shape Scotland's destiny, simultaneously fueling internal conflicts while providing the foundation that enabled Scots to endure centuries of hardship. But clan leaders and warriors weren't the only ones living by the sword. For Scotland's overwhelming majority, peasants, laborers, craftsmen forming society's backbone, life meant unending struggle against poverty, illness, and oppression. From toddlerhood, peasant children toiled in fields from dawn till dusk, learning early that their lot was ceaseless labor for overlords with scant hope of betterment. As they aged, work grew more grueling and hazardous. Men spent endless hours plowing fields, herding sheep, and cutting peat for fuel, their bodies twisted and broken by decades of backbreaking labor. Women shouldered dual burdens, laboring alongside husbands while bearing and nursing children. In mines and quarries, workers toiled in dank, lightless tunnels, hacking at earth with primitive tools and hauling heavy loads of stone or coal. Cave-ins, explosions, and slow suffocation from black lung disease claimed countless lives. Even those escaping such fates found little respite from daily hardships. Peasant families crowded into cramped, smoky hovels, often sharing space with livestock for warmth during bitter winters. Their meager diet consisted mainly of oats, barley, and whatever vegetables could be coaxed from thin, rocky soil, occasionally supplemented by scraps of meat or fish when fortune smiled. Hunger shadowed them constantly, especially during famines or wars when marauding armies burned crops and slaughtered livestock. In such desperate times, peasants resorted to eating grass, bark, or even dirt to survive, their bodies slowly wasting to skeletal frames. And always, the specter of disease lurked nearby. In an era before modern medicine, even minor illnesses could prove fatal. Deadly epidemics, smallpox, typhoid, and the dreaded bubonic plague swept through communities like wildfire, leaving devastation in their wake. For peasant families scratching out an existence in this unforgiving land, survival was a daily battle. They rose before dawn to tend fields and livestock, laboring until their hands were raw and their backs screamed with exhaustion. They subsisted on whatever meager crops they could harvest or forage, huddling for warmth in drafty, vermin-infested huts. Yet even amid such hardship, they found fleeting moments of joy and connection. Seasonal festivals offered rare reprieves, music from fiddles and pipes filling the night air as they danced beneath the stars. Around crackling hearths, they shared stories and songs, passing down legends that bound them to their ancestors. Faith provided solace, though the church demanded heavy tithes and rigid obedience. And in each other, they found strength, forging bonds of kinship and community that sustained them through the darkest times. But the church, which promised salvation in the afterlife, could also be a source of oppression in this one. The Catholic Church stood alongside the clans as medieval Scotland's most dominant power, its influence reaching into every corner of life, from the lowest serf to the highest noble. All were expected to surrender a tenth of their earnings to the church, enriching bishops and abbots while their own families went hungry. The clergy controlled vast tracts of land, wielding both spiritual and temporal authority. Yet their tightest grip was on morality and belief. The Bible's teachings and the Pope's decrees were absolute law, and any deviation from orthodoxy invited swift, brutal punishment. Heretics and blasphemers faced ecclesiastical courts, where accusations led to imprisonment, torture, or even burning at the stake. The church's reach extended into the most intimate aspects of life. Marriage was a sacrament strictly regulated by priests, divorce nearly impossible, and those who defied teachings on chastity risked public shaming or excommunication. Still, amid its strictures, the church offered some comfort. Great abbeys and monasteries dotted the landscape, serving as centers of learning and charity. Monks and nuns tended the sick, fed the hungry, and sheltered weary travelers. Among these figures stood Saint Margaret, the English princess who became Scotland's queen in the 11th century. A woman of deep piety and compassion, she worked tirelessly to reform the Scottish Church, aligning it with Roman practices while championing education and care for the poor. She founded hospitals, orphanages, and monasteries, leaving a legacy of mercy long after her death. Yet even Margaret's saintly influence couldn't soften the Church's darker side. As fears of witchcraft and heresy grew, clergy took an increasingly aggressive role in hunting down suspected devil worshippers. Witch trials became commonplace in 16th and 17th century Scotland, with accused women subjected to brutal interrogations until they confessed. Many were tortured or burned alive, their screams echoing as warnings to others who might stray from righteousness. Thus, the people of Scotland found themselves trapped between two forces, the demands of their clan chiefs and the dictates of their church. Their lives were shaped by loyalty and piety, by the need for protection and the fear of divine wrath. It was a fragile balance, easily shattered by war or the whims of fate. And as history unfolded, those forces would clash with ever greater intensity. For even as clans warred among themselves and the church tightened its grip, a new threat gathered on the horizon. To the south, England's kings had long hungered for Scotland's lands, viewing the northern realm as a wild frontier ripe for conquest. In 1296, Edward I of England, called Longshanks for his imposing height, launched a full-scale invasion, claiming lordship over the Scottish crown. His armies stormed across the border, razing towns and crushing resistance. The Scots, outnumbered and unprepared, were swiftly overwhelmed. Their king, John Balliol, was captured and forced to abdicate, his crown handed to Edward as a trophy. Scotland was now under English rule, its people subjected to foreign laws and foreign masters. But the Scots would not bow quietly. In the years that followed, rebellions erupted across the land, led by figures whose names would echo through history. Among them was William Wallace, a minor knight who became the scourge of the English. Driven by love for his homeland and hatred for its oppressors, Wallace rallied guerrilla fighters, launching daring raids on English supply lines and garrisons. His greatest triumph came at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, where his outnumbered forces used the narrow crossing to trap and slaughter the English army. The victory made Wallace a legend, a symbol of defiance against impossible odds. But his success was short-lived. The following year, a massive English force crushed his army at Falkirk. Wallace became a fugitive until his eventual betrayal and capture in 1305. Dragged to London in chains, he endured a sham trial before being hanged, drawn, and quartered, his body dismembered, his head displayed on London Bridge as a warning. Yet his martyrdom only fueled Scotland's resolve. In 1314, at the Battle of Bannockburn, Robert the Bruce led the Scots to a stunning victory, proving their fight for freedom was far from over. The victory at Bannockburn marked a turning point in Scotland's wars of independence, a moment when the beleaguered nation finally glimpsed the possibility of triumph against its powerful southern neighbor. Robert the Bruce's brilliant tactics and the unbreakable spirit of his spearmen had defied all expectations, proving that English armor and numbers could be overcome. Yet the struggle was far from finished, and the years ahead would test Scotland's resilience in ways few could have anticipated. As the Stuart dynasty gradually consolidated power, Scotland's common folk continued enduring hardships that would be unimaginable today. Their existence remained a constant battle for survival, not just against rival clans or foreign invaders, but against the very land itself. Scotland's harsh climate and unforgiving terrain made agriculture a relentless challenge. Thin, acidic soil yielded meager harvests while the pervasive damp cold seeped into bones, making every working day from sunrise to sunset an exercise in endurance. Peasants cultivated oats, barley, and peas in narrow strips using primitive wooden plows dragged by oxen. Small kitchen gardens produced turnips and cabbages, but a single failed harvest could doom families to starvation through the long winters. The feudal system compounded their misery. Local lords claimed most of their hard-won produce as rent, leaving barely enough for survival. A man's worth was measured not in coin, but in livestock and fighting ability, in a world where even lowland farmers lived in constant fear of Highland cattle raids. This brutal environment bred tough individuals. Clan feuds persisted for generations with no resolution in sight. Family bonds themselves grew fragile under the strain of relentless poverty and violence. Marriage was primarily an economic arrangement rather than a romantic union. A peasant woman might only wear shoes once in her life. At her wedding, crude cowhide scraps tied to her feet for the occasion. Children represented both blessing and burden, more mouths to feed, but also extra hands for field work and peat cutting. The wails of grieving mothers formed a constant backdrop to village life as countless infants succumbed to disease, malnutrition, or simple exposure. Yet through all this suffering, the Scottish people clung fiercely to life and tradition. The same clan system that fueled bloody conflicts also provided an irreplaceable sense of identity and belonging. Loyalty to kin became the fire that warmed spirits against life's bitter chill. The Catholic Church, for all its flaws, offered structure and solace in this chaotic world. Parish priests might threaten hellfire to maintain control, but they also baptized newborns, solemnized marriages, and administered last rites to the dying. Great abbeys and priories served as rare havens of learning and refuge, where even the lowliest serf could find temporary shelter. Among these sanctuaries stood Dunfermline Abbey, burial place of kings and birthplace of perhaps Scotland's most influential queen, St. Margaret. Born an English princess in exile, Margaret combined deep piety with iron determination. When she came north in 1070 to marry King Malcolm III, she was appalled by what she saw as the primitive state of Scottish Christianity. Celtic tradition still dominated, blending uneasily with Roman Catholic practices. With righteous zeal, the new queen set about reforming the church, insisting on proper Sabbath observance, cracking down on drunken priests who thought nothing of swigging ale during Mass, and promoting Latin liturgy over Gaelic. Though living in luxury, Margaret became renowned for her charity, establishing ferry services for pilgrims, washing the feet of paupers, and founding hospitals and orphanages. Her remarkable influence even softened her warrior husband's harsh policies, creating a bridge between Anglo-Saxon and Celtic royal lines. Tragically, her life was cut short in 1093 when news of Malcolm's death and battle broke her health. As she lay dying, clutching her precious relics, she whispered prayers until the end. Margaret's legacy endured long after her death. She had dragged the Scottish Church toward European mainstream Catholicism and demonstrated how royal power could be tempered with mercy. Yet such lofty achievements meant little to the common folk she had tried to help. Their lives continued as always, a relentless cycle of labor and endurance as history's tide surged around them. Then in 1350, death came calling on an unprecedented scale. The Black Death arrived aboard merchant ships, creeping into Scottish ports before spreading inland with terrifying speed. Contemporary accounts describe unimaginable horror, entire families wiped out overnight, bodies piled in streets, the sick abandoned to die alone as hideous buboes swelled in their armpits and groins. Some blamed Jews for poisoning wells. Others saw the plague as divine punishment. Groups of flagellants wandered the countryside, whipping themselves bloody in desperate atonement. When the pestilence finally receded, nearly a third of Scotland's population lay dead. Fields stood untended, cattle roamed ownerless, and markets fell silent. Recovery would take generations, yet life stubbornly persisted. Survivors buried their dead and rebuilt their shattered communities, clinging to ancient customs that had sustained their ancestors. In the Highlands, clans still gathered for seasonal cattle drives. In the Lowlands, towns slowly revived as craftsmen and merchants resumed their trades. But even as Scotland regained its footing, new challenges emerged. Despite Queen Margaret's reforms, many still clung to old Celtic ways. The growing power of the Stuart kings widened the divide between Gaelic-speaking Highlands and Scots-speaking Lowlands. In the north, clan chiefs ruled like independent monarchs, their lives intertwined with the agricultural cycles that sustained their people. Consider Angus MacTavish, a typical Highland tenant farmer on Campbell lands. From dawn till dusk, he labored in rocky fields, pausing only to wipe sweat from his brow and glance at his chief's distant tower house, a constant reminder of where true power lay. Recent cattle raids by MacDonald's weighed heavily on his mind. His brother hadn't returned from the last skirmish. Now rumors swirled of retaliation, of another bloody chapter in their ancient feud. Such was life in the Highlands, a perpetual dance of violence and vengeance as old as the misty glens themselves. The Highlands and Lowlands of Scotland might as well have been separate kingdoms, so stark was the cultural divide between them. To the Scots-speaking Lowlanders, their Gaelic cousins in the north were little more than barbarians, lawless cattle thieves who painted their faces before battle and spoke in a tongue as foreign as the Norse invaders of old. This mutual distrust festered for centuries, with lowland nobles and English administrators alike dismissing Highland traditions as primitive and savage. Yet the Highlands had their own proud rulers, none more powerful than the Lords of the Isles, who from their stronghold at Finlagan Castle governed the Hebrides and Western Highlands like independent monarchs throughout the 1300s and early 1400s. These Gaelic princes maintained their own courts, waged private wars, and even conducted diplomacy with England as if they were a sovereign nation. Their power became so formidable that in 1462, John MacDonald II launched open rebellion against James III, only to be defeated near Inverness. The Stuart kings' attempts to tame their Highland subjects met with limited success. James IV played the peacemaker in 1493, extracting pledges of loyalty from clan chiefs during a much-publicized tour of the Isles. Yet once his ships disappeared over the horizon, the chiefs promptly resumed their raiding ways. His son James V took a harder line in 1540, sailing around the Western Isles with a naval squadron to personally accept submissions from the MacLeods of Dunvegan and MacDonalds of Duniveg. These displays of royal authority proved fleeting. The Highlands remained a world apart, where clan loyalty outweighed any fealty to distant kings. The Gaelic language formed the bedrock of this separate identity, the medium through which bards preserved clan genealogies and warriors sang of past glories. As lowland power grew, systematic efforts to suppress Gaelic culture intensified. The Statutes of Iona in 1609 forced Highland chiefs to educate their heirs in English and Protestantism, while later laws banned traditional dress and customs outright. Yet despite this official hostility, practical connections between Highlands and Lowlands persisted. Great cattle trysts at Crieff and Falkirk saw Highland drovers bringing their black cattle south to lowland markets, with up to 100,000 beasts making the annual trek by the 1500s. Lowland merchants in turn supplied wine, textiles, and metal goods unavailable in the Highlands. Strategic marriages occasionally bridged the divide too, like James IV 1503 arrangement that made the Campbell Chief Earl of Argyll through marriage to a royal kinswoman. For all their differences, both regions would face the ultimate equalizer in 1350, the Black Death. This horror arrived silently aboard trading vessels, creeping into Scottish ports before exploding across the countryside with terrifying speed. Contemporary chronicler John of Verdun recorded the devastation. There was so great a destruction of people that scarcely anyone dared go out of doors for fear of catching the disease. The plague showed no respect for rank or region. Entire families perished behind doors marked with white crosses, their homes later burned to contain the contagion. Mass graves swallowed victims by the dozens as the living struggled to bury the dead fast enough. In some districts, only 1 in 3 survived. The social fabric unraveled. Crops rotted in fields, livestock wandered untended, and the complex networks of feudal obligation collapsed overnight. Scotland's recovery was agonizingly slow, punctuated by fresh outbreaks in 1361, 1380 and 1392. Yet from this crucible of suffering emerged unexpected benefits. With laborers now scarce, surviving peasants could demand better terms from landlords. The old feudal order began its gradual decline, though it would take generations to fully unravel. Through it all, the Scottish people adapted with characteristic resilience. Highlanders maintained their seasonal cattle drives despite the devastation, the skirl of bagpipes echoing defiantly through empty glens. Lowland burghers slowly revived their towns, reopening the great fairs that had once fueled Scotland's economy. Wool, hides, saltfish, and other goods began moving again along ancient trade routes. But the psychological scars ran deep. A new morbidity permeated Scottish art and literature, with the Dance of Death motif serving as constant reminder of life's fragility. People drew up wills earlier, donated more to churches, and clung to relics and rituals that promised protection from the pestilence's return. The trauma of the plague years became woven into Scotland's collective memory, referenced for centuries afterward in folk tales and ballads about the foul death. As Scotland emerged from this apocalyptic period, its people carried the hard-won wisdom that nothing, not clan loyalty, not royal decrees, not even the church's promises, could shield them from the capriciousness of fate. They had stared into the abyss and survived, but the experience left them forever changed, their worldview tempered by loss yet strangely enriched by the determination to carry on. The clan system formed the beating heart of Highland society, an intricate web of kinship and loyalty that defined every aspect of life in Scotland's untamed north. In Gaelic, clan literally meant children, and this was no mere metaphor. These were extended family groups tracing descent from common ancestors, bound by blood oaths that held greater sway than any royal decree. At the pinnacle stood the chief, the synod or head of the kin, a near-royal figure commanding absolute allegiance in exchange for protection and justice. Chiefship typically passed to the eldest son, though the MacLeods of Dunvegan famously traced lineage through female heirs for several generations. When succession disputes erupted, they often turned violent, like the 15th century feud between the MacDonalds of Ardnamurchan and the MacDonalds of Islay over the forfeited lordship of the Isles. To be without clan in the Highlands was to be adrift in a dangerous world. No identity, no protection, no place in the social order. Clans organized themselves into complex hierarchies. Septs and branches each had their own captains under the chief's overall command. Tacksmen, lesser chiefs, and Deo and Yule gentry served as officers over units of clansmen, while at the bottom labored tenant farmers working clan lands. Service to one's chief superseded all other obligations. Clansmen paid tribute in kind from their harvests and answered the call to arms without hesitation. Young boys trained from childhood with broadsword and targe, learning that glorious death and service to clan honor was the highest aspiration. This martial culture arose from brutal necessity. The Highlands' remote glens and windswept islands formed a patchwork of territories constantly in flux through raids and feuds. Cattle theft served as both rite of passage and payback for slights to clan honor. Every man went armed, a basket-hilted broadsword, dirk, and targe, leather-covered wooden shield, being standard equipment. Wealthier warriors wore habergeons, knee-length mail shirts, while the poorest might have only a leather jerkin for protection. When not fighting, Highlanders showcased their skills in games of strength, tossing the cobber, tree trunk, putting the stone, and mock battles that often turned deadly serious. For defeated clans, the consequences were catastrophic. Loss of cattle meant starvation, while captured warriors faced execution or enslavement. Clan chiefs constantly jockeyed for position through strategic marriages, fosterage exchanges, and oaths sworn on holy relics. Their intricate diplomacy played out against the backdrop of greater powers, the lordship of the Isles, the earldoms of Mar and Moray, and the Stuart monarchy when it bothered to notice Highland affairs. Remarkably, amidst this relentless violence, Gaelic culture flourished. The clan was everything: identity, social safety net, and reason for being in a land with no other institutions. Great feasts brought communities together in all their finery. Women in embroidered silk, men in woven tartans and feathered bonnets. The haunting wail of bagpipes and intricate fingerwork of clarsack, Gaelic harp, players filled the night air as bards recited genealogies stretching back centuries. Though life was brutal and often short, it pulsed with a communal spirit alien to modern individualism. Yet this way of life increasingly came under threat as the Scottish crown sought to civilize the Highlands. James VI particularly despised what he called the clan's unreason, barbarity, and contempt. His 1609 Statutes of Iona struck at Gaelic culture's roots, banning hereditary bards, requiring chiefly heirs to be educated in English Protestant schools, and outlawing private warfare. Subsequent laws proscribed traditional dress, weapons, and even the Gaelic language itself in official settings. The stage was set for the systematic dismantling of clan society, a process that would culminate in the brutal aftermath of the 1745 Jacobite uprising. But in the medieval period we're examining, the old ways still held sway. Consider the infamous feud between Clan Campbell and Clan MacDonald, a centuries-long vendetta that exemplified both the nobility and savagery of the clan system. It began in the early 1300s when Robert the Bruce granted Campbell allies lands in Argyll that the MacDonalds considered theirs by ancient right. The resulting bad blood festered for generations, erupting in periodic massacres. The darkest chapter came in 1646 at Duniveg Castle, where 300 MacDonalds, men, women, and children, had taken refuge from Campbell forces. After surrendering on promises of quarter, they were systematically butchered, their mutilated bodies thrown into the sea. Yet clan politics made for strange bedfellows. In the 1490s, when James IV stripped the MacDonalds of the lordship of the Isles, it was the Campbell Earl of Argyll who argued for preserving MacDonald territories, not out of friendship, but to maintain a balance of power favoring his own clan. Such shifting alliances characterized Highland politics. Today's mortal enemy might become tomorrow's crucial ally against a common threat. For ordinary clansfolk living under this constant shadow of violence, existence demanded perpetual vigilance. Peel towers dotted the landscape as refuges during raids. Women and children kept sacks of oats and smoked herring ready for sudden sieges. The dreaded rallying cry Cruachan. The Campbell war cry, or Glencoe, could send entire communities scrambling for safety at a moment's notice. Men worked fields with weapons close at hand, ready to muster when the fiery cross, a charred stick wrapped in blood-stained cloth, passed from village to village as the call to arms. Even in sleep, they remained alert for the warning blare of a cow horn signaling approaching danger. Their very appearance reflected this warrior ethos, armed to the teeth, with the semi-permanent scowl of men living on the edge of survival. While the clan warriors and chiefs dominated Highland society, the true backbone of medieval Scotland lay in its peasant class, the forgotten multitudes who toiled in obscurity to sustain the entire feudal system. Their existence was one of unrelenting drudgery, a daily grind that would break most modern individuals within weeks. From the moment they could walk, peasant children were thrust into the workforce, their small hands learning to grip tools before they could properly spell their names. In the rocky Highland fields, generations of the same families worked the same narrow strips of land, their wooden plows barely scratching the surface of the stubborn soil. Oats and barley formed the staples of their meager diet, supplemented occasionally by turnips or cabbages from tiny kitchen gardens. Meat was a rare luxury, perhaps a scrawny chicken or, on feast days, a shred of mutton from an aging sheep. Most survived on thin porridge and rough oat cakes, washing them down with weak ale since drinking water often carried disease. The feudal system ensured their perpetual poverty. As tenants at will, they owed their overlords not only a portion of their harvest, but also backbreaking labor services, repairing roads, building fortifications, or working the lord's personal fields. A Qatar, landless laborer, might spend half his week toiling on the chief's land just for the right to farm a tiny plot of marginal soil. Even relatively prosperous tenants could see everything taken by a bad harvest or a clan raid. Women bore a double burden, working the fields alongside men while managing households and raising large families in single-room hovels shared with livestock. Childbirth was a perilous ordeal with high mortality rates, and many mothers buried multiple infants taken by disease or malnutrition. Those who survived grew up fast. Girls learned spinning, weaving, and brewing by age 7, while boys trained with makeshift weapons in between farm chores. Disease stalked these communities relentlessly. Beyond the catastrophic Black Death, routine illnesses like dysentery, tuberculosis and smallpox carried off scores annually. Lepers were driven into isolation, their rotting limbs terrifying reminders of the body's fragility. Medical knowledge was practically non-existent. Peasant families relied on folk remedies like poultices of moldy bread, an accidental precursor to penicillin, or charms against elf shot, their explanation for sudden pains. The church provided some solace, but also extracted its pound of flesh. Peasants were required to tithe the tenth of their meager harvest to support lavish monasteries where corpulent abbots feasted on roast meats and fine wines. Those who couldn't pay faced excommunication, a terrifying prospect that condemned their souls to hell. Yet these same monasteries also offered rare charity, with monks distributing alms to the destitute and maintaining hospices for the sick and dying. One such refuge was Dunfermline Abbey, where Queen Margaret had established traditions of benevolence. Here, even the lowest serf could find temporary shelter, though they'd still be required to kiss the abbey's holy relics and swear loyalty to its overlords. The abbey's soaring Gothic arches and jeweled shrines stood in stark contrast to the peasants' hovels, a deliberate display of the church's temporal power meant to awe the masses into submission. For amusement, peasants had few diversions beyond seasonal festivals. Beltane fires welcomed summer, while Samhain marked the start of winter with rituals to ward off spirits. Weddings provided rare occasions for music and dancing, though even these were constrained by church prohibitions against lewd behavior. Storytelling around the hearth preserved ancient tales of heroes and monsters, often blending Christian motifs with older pagan traditions. The psychological toll of this existence was immense. Most peasants lived in a state of constant anxiety, fear of famine, fear of raids, fear of their overlords' whims. A poor harvest could force families to make unthinkable choices, like abandoning elders to die so the young might survive. Some turned to petty theft or poaching, risking brutal punishments if caught. Thieves might lose a hand, poachers an eye. Others sought escape in homemade ale or the occasional mushroom-induced visions. Yet through it all, they persevered with a quiet dignity that modern observers often overlook. Their unrecorded labor built the foundations upon which Scottish nobility and royalty rose to power. Their sweat and blood nourished the very soil that clan chiefs and kings fought over. And when called to war, these same downtrodden peasants could transform into formidable warriors, their intimate knowledge of the land making them invaluable guerrilla fighters against English invaders. The 14th century Scottish poet John Barber perhaps best captured their spirit when he wrote of Bannockburn's common soldiers. They were hardy, strong, and stout, and in their hearts was no doubt. This simple epitaph speaks volumes about the medieval Scottish peasantry, their resilience forged through daily hardship, their courage born of having nothing left to lose. The medieval Scottish peasants' relationship with the land was one of both intimate connection and brutal struggle. Each morning before dawn's first light, they would rise from straw-filled pallets, their muscles already aching from yesterday's labor, yet knowing today would bring the same relentless toil. Stepping outside their crude stone and turf dwellings, they would greet fields that demanded everything yet yielded little. Thin, rocky soil that mocked their efforts with meager harvests. Agricultural methods had changed little since the Iron Age. Teams of oxen dragged cumbersome wooden plows through stubborn earth, the beasts often as undernourished as their handlers. Farmers sowed seeds by hand in narrow rigs, their backs permanently bent from centuries of stooping labor. They practiced run-rig farming, dividing land into strips that were periodically redistributed to ensure fairness, though this also prevented long-term soil improvement. Crop rotation was virtually unknown, leaving fields exhausted after successive plantings of oats and barley. Weather dictated survival. A dry spring could wither young shoots. Summer rains might flatten ripening grain. But the true terror came in autumn gales. Storms howling in from the North Sea could destroy a year's work in hours, leaving families to face winter with empty granaries. In such desperate times, peasants turned to foraging for wild garlic, nettles, and even tree bark to supplement their dwindling stores. Some resorted to eating their seed corn, dooming next year's harvest in a bid to survive the present. Livestock represented both wealth and vulnerability. A family might own a few scrawny sheep or a milk cow, treasured assets that required constant protection. Highland cattle raids weren't mere property crimes, but existential threats, as the loss of even a single cow could condemn a household to starvation. Women became adept at cheese making and butter preservation, stretching every drop of milk into calorie-rich winter stores. Chickens provided eggs until they became Sunday dinner, a rare protein source usually reserved for the elderly or nursing mothers. The peasant home was a far cry from romanticized cottage imagery. Most lived in black houses, low windowless structures with walls of unmortared stone and roofs thatched with heather or turf. A central hearth provided meager warmth, its smoke seeping through the roof rather than finding escape through a proper chimney. Families shared these cramped spaces with livestock during winter, the body heat from cows or sheep helping stave off hypothermia. Fleas, lice, and rats were constant companions, spreading disease as they pleased. Furniture was minimal, perhaps a crude table, some stools, and storage chests. Beds were piles of straw covered with rough wool blankets. The floor was packed earth, often damp and crawling with insects. Personal possessions might include an iron cooking pot, wooden bowls, a spindle for wool, and if the family was fortunate, an heirloom tool like a forged sickle. Clothing was homespun wool, scratchy and rarely washed, with children often wearing handed-down garments until they disintegrated. Yet within these harsh parameters, peasants demonstrated remarkable ingenuity. They mastered the art of peat cutting, carefully slicing fuel bricks from bogs and stacking them to dry. They built ingenious, lazy beds, raised garden plots layered with seaweed fertilizer. Women developed sophisticated textile skills, spinning coarse wool into serviceable cloth and using natural dyes from plants like woad and madder root. Some villages maintained communal ovens where families could bake bread in rotation, saving precious fuel. The church's liturgical calendar provided structure to their year. Major festivals like Christmas and Easter offered brief respites from labor, though priests still demanded their tithes, even in famine years. Peasants developed their own folk Christianity, blending Orthodox rituals with older pagan traditions, hanging rowan branches over doors to ward off evil, or leaving offerings at holy wells. This syncretic faith helped them cope with life's cruelties, offering explanations for misfortune and hope for better days beyond the grave. Education was virtually non-existent for peasant children. What knowledge they acquired came through oral tradition, songs teaching farming lore, ballads recounting clan history, folktales warning against fairies and witches. A select few might learn basic letters by serving as altar boys, but most lived and died illiterate. Their world was intensely local. Few traveled more than 10 miles from their birthplace in a lifetime, making market days and fairs their only window on the wider world. When death came, as it often did prematurely, peasants were buried in unconsecrated ground unless their families could pay for church rites. Graveyards held poignant evidence of their struggles, clusters of tiny graves marking infant mortality rates that sometimes exceeded 50%. Those who survived to old age faced new horrors. Tooth loss made chewing difficult, arthritis turned simple movements agonizing, and failing vision led to terrible accidents with tools or fires. Through it all, the peasantry developed a dark, pragmatic humor that still characterizes Scottish wit today. They mocked their overlords in veiled songs, found levity in life's absurdities, and took perverse pride in enduring what would break softer Southerners. This unbreakable spirit would prove crucial when called to defend their homeland. The same farmers who trembled before their laird could become fearless guerrillas in Wallace's rebel army or form the unyielding Chilterns at Bannockburn. The spiritual world loomed large in the medieval Scottish peasants' worldview, an invisible realm as real to them as the rocky soil beneath their feet. Their Christianity existed in uneasy tension with older beliefs, creating a unique folk religion that colored every aspect of daily life. When a peasant woman hung a horseshoe over her door or made the sign of the cross at the sound of an owl's cry, she wasn't engaging in superstition, but rather navigating what she knew to be a world thick with supernatural forces. Parish churches stood as the most substantial buildings in rural communities, their stone walls a stark contrast to the flimsy peasant dwellings surrounding them. Yet attendance at Mass was often as much about social obligation as genuine devotion. The Latin liturgy remained incomprehensible to most, though they could recognize key phrases like "Hoc est corpus meum," "This is my body," which eventually entered folk magic as the nonsense phrase "hocus pocus." More meaningful were the tangible rituals, the tasting of consecrated bread, the sprinkling of holy water, the annual Easter confession that cleansed a year's accumulated sins. The church calendar structured agricultural life. Plowing began after Candlemas, February 2nd. Sheep were sent to summer pastures at Beltane, May 1st, and harvest concluded by Michaelmas, September 29th. These holy days provided rare breaks from toil, though even festivals were constrained by the church's growing suspicion of pagan celebrations. Dancing around maypoles or lighting midsummer bonfires might draw accusations of witchcraft from increasingly puritanical clergy. Peasants maintained their own sacred geography. Holy wells dedicated to saints like Columba or Bride were believed to cure ailments when visited at certain times. Standing stones and ancient cairns, though officially condemned by the church, were still used for secret rituals. Cluty wells, accumulated strips of cloth tied by petitioners, each rag representing a prayer that would be carried to heaven as the fabric decayed. Such practices infuriated church authorities but persisted because they addressed needs formal religion couldn't, ensuring fertility, healing sick livestock, or protecting against the evil eye. Witchcraft accusations often arose from this spiritual borderland. When a cow stopped giving milk or a child fell ill, peasants might suspect maleficium, harmful magic, from a disgruntled neighbor. The accused were typically marginalized women, midwives who knew herbal lore, beggars who cursed when denied alms, or simply the village eccentric who talked to herself. Once denounced, they faced horrific interrogations by church and secular authorities eager to root out heresy. The witch panic reached its peak in the 16th to 17th centuries, but its roots lay in the medieval period. John Knox's fiery sermons demonizing Catholic sorcery created an atmosphere where folk healers could be transformed into devil-worshipping monsters overnight. Standard questioning techniques included sleep deprivation, thumb screws, and the infamous witch's bridle, an iron muzzle with spikes that pierced the tongue. Those who confessed under torture faced public execution, usually by burning. Yet even amidst this climate of fear, peasant resistance persisted. Communities often protected their wise women, knowing these healers provided the only medical care available. Some accused witches became folk heroes posthumously, their names invoked as protective charms. The line between saint and sorcerer remained blurry in popular imagination. Saint Columba was said to have banished a water monster from Loch Ness, while Saint Margaret's relics were believed to cure infertility. Death rituals revealed this syncretism most clearly. While the church insisted on proper burial in consecrated ground, peasants still placed coins on corpses' eyes, a pagan holdover to pay the ferryman to the afterlife. Wake games involving riddles and drinking honored the deceased, while subtly mocking the clergy's somber funeral rites. The dead were believed to linger close to home for a time, requiring offerings of food and drink at their gravesides. This complex spiritual landscape shaped how peasants interpreted disasters. When the Black Death struck, some saw it as divine punishment, others as the work of witches or Jews. Processions of flagellants marched through villages, their self-whipping meant to atone for collective sin. Magical protections proliferated, charms written on parchment, herbal amulets, even the painting of crosses on doors with supposedly protective mixtures containing questionable ingredients. Through all this, the peasantry maintained a pragmatic faith. They attended Mass when required, paid tithes when compelled, but reserved their deepest spiritual energies for practices that addressed immediate needs: healing the sick, blessing crops, protecting newborns from fairies. Their religion was less about theology than survival, a toolkit for navigating a world where the supernatural was always just one misstep away. The Scottish peasants' relationship with nobility and royalty existed in a perpetual state of tension, a complex dance of dependence and resentment that shaped medieval society's very foundations. While clan chiefs and feudal lords lived in relative luxury, their power ultimately rested on the backs of these unseen laborers who cultivated the land. This uneasy symbiosis created social dynamics that could erupt into violence when pushed too far. Castles and tower houses dominated the physical and psychological landscape. Peasants approaching their lord's stone stronghold would crane their necks upward at the imposing battlements, a constant reminder of where true power resided. Within those walls, the nobility enjoyed comforts unimaginable to commoners: glass-paned windows, imported tapestries, and great halls warmed by massive fireplaces. The lord's table groaned under the weight of roasted meats, spiced wines, and delicate pastries, while just outside the gates, peasant children might be scavenging for discarded bones. Yet this wealth came at a price of constant insecurity. Noble families lived in fear of peasant uprisings, their castles designed as much to intimidate their own tenants as to repel external threats. The infamous Murdrum laws imposed heavy fines on villages if a Norman lord was killed and the perpetrator not identified, effectively making communities collectively responsible for noble safety. Some lords maintained private prisons where troublesome peasants could be left to rot without trial. The justice system overwhelmingly favored the privileged. A nobleman might pay a fine for killing a peasant, while the reverse meant gruesome public execution. Land disputes were invariably settled in the lord's favor, with peasants having no right to legal representation. Even the church's courts, which theoretically offered some protection, typically sided with wealthy donors over poor supplicants. Taxation took many insidious forms. Beyond the standard feudal dues, peasants faced arbitrary talliage, payments demanded at the lord's whim. Millers were required to grind grain at the lord's mill for a fee, bakers to use the lord's ovens, and all households to pay for castle guard, whether soldiers were needed or not. Corvée labor, unpaid work on roads, bridges, or fortifications, could be demanded at planting or harvest time, potentially dooming a family's own crops. Some lords exercised their droit du seigneur, lord's right, to sleep with peasant brides on their wedding night, a practice historians debate, but which certainly existed in popular imagination as the ultimate symbol of oppression. More verifiably, many maintained private armies of gillies, retainers, who could seize crops or livestock at will under the pretext of unpaid debts. Yet peasant resistance took many forms, from the overt to the subtle. Some joined rebel forces like William Wallace's guerrillas, where a serf could become a war hero overnight. Others engaged in calculated foot-dragging, working to rule, in modern terms, doing the absolute minimum required. Poaching the lord's deer became both protein supplement and political statement, despite the risk of losing a hand if caught. More ingenious were the legal challenges. Astute peasants might exploit feudal law's very complexity, finding loopholes in ancient charters or appealing to higher authorities. Some villages pooled resources to hire scribes who could document long-standing customs before they were erased by greedy lords. The church occasionally intervened when tithes were threatened. A monastery might protect peasant rights if their own income depended on that village's productivity. Women developed their own forms of resistance. The rough music tradition saw peasant women publicly shaming abusive lords or their agents through satirical songs and effigy burnings. Midwives could spread subversive gossip under the guise of women's talk, while alewives, female brewers, often controlled information networks through their taverns. When outright rebellion did erupt, it was usually spontaneous and localized. A village might rise up to destroy an unpopular lord's new fish pond, which had flooded their fields, or attack tax collectors during lean years. These revolts were rarely documented unless violently suppressed, but court records hint at their frequency through repeated prohibitions against peasant assemblies. The Scottish Wars of Independence provided unexpected opportunities for peasant agency. Both English and Scottish nobility desperately needed peasant support, leading to temporary improvements in conditions. Robert the Bruce famously promised land reforms to secure peasant loyalty, though many pledges were forgotten after Bannockburn. Still, the conflict demonstrated that peasant warriors, when properly motivated, could decide the fate of kingdoms. By the late medieval period, gradual changes were undermining the feudal order. The Black Death's population collapse gave surviving peasants increased bargaining power. Some managed to commute labor services into cash payments, while others fled to growing towns where town air makes free after a year and a day. The rise of a money economy allowed clever peasants to buy their way out of serfdom, though this remained rare in Scotland compared to England or Europe. The slow unraveling of Scotland's medieval feudal order accelerated dramatically in the plague's aftermath, as surviving peasants discovered their labor had acquired unprecedented value. Villages that had once meekly accepted their lord's demands now found they could negotiate better terms, or simply walk away to seek opportunities elsewhere. This quiet revolution transformed rural Scotland more profoundly than any battlefield victory, though its heroes remain nameless in history books. With nearly a third of the population wiped out by the Black Death, the age-old equation of too many workers for too little land had suddenly reversed. Landlords desperate to retain tenants began offering concessions, reduced rents, fixed-term leases, even cash wages for farm work. The traditional bondage system, where peasants were legally tied to their lord's estate, started crumbling as laborers realized their mobility meant power. Some particularly enterprising peasants managed to lease entire farms, becoming the first generation of independent yeoman farmers. Wages for skilled agricultural workers soared. A master plowman could now demand double his pre-plague earnings, while thatchers, masons, and other specialists found themselves in such demand they could pick and choose employers. The Scottish Parliament's frantic attempts to cap wages through legislation, like the 1364 Statutes of Labourers, proved largely unenforceable as lords competed illegally for scarce workers. Even unskilled laborers found they could insist on being paid in coin rather than kind, a small but significant step toward economic independence. The changes extended to women's roles as well. With so many men lost to plague, widows and unmarried women took over farms and trades that would have been unthinkable before. Brewing, baking, and textile production became increasingly female-dominated occupations. Some women even appeared in court records as property holders, a radical departure from traditional norms requiring male guardianship. This newfound peasant leverage manifested in subtle but profound ways. The traditional open field system, where villagers farmed scattered strips under communal rules, gradually gave way to more individualized landholding. Stone farmhouses began replacing the old turf dwellings, their durability reflecting growing confidence in permanent tenure. Inventories from the late 1300s show peasant households acquiring previously unthinkable luxuries: iron cooking pots, woolen blankets, even the occasional silver spoon. Yet this upward mobility bred fierce resistance from the nobility. Landlords attempted to roll back peasant gains through legal maneuvers. Converting arable land to sheep pastures required fewer workers, or enclosing common lands that villages had relied upon for grazing. Some resurrected archaic feudal dues that had lapsed during the crisis years. The clergy proved particularly tenacious in defending their privileges, with monasteries being among the last institutions to relinquish unpaid peasant labor. The church's moral authority suffered irreparable damage from its behavior during the plague. While some priests heroically tended the sick, many fled their parishes, leaving laypeople to conduct makeshift funeral rites. The spectacle of wealthy bishops demanding full tithes from decimated villages bred lasting resentment that would fuel the Protestant Reformation centuries later. Urban centers became magnets for discontented peasants. Scotland's burghs offered the tantalizing promise of freedom. After living in a town for a year and a day, a runaway serf could claim legal independence. Apprenticeship records show a surge of rural surnames in trades like weaving and metalworking during the late 1300s. These migrant peasants brought their dialects and traditions with them, creating vibrant urban cultures that blended rural and cosmopolitan influences. The legal system struggled to adapt. Peasants increasingly used courts to challenge lordly abuses, sometimes even winning cases against powerful nobles. A new class of peasant gentry emerged, literate small landowners who acted as intermediaries between manors and villages. Their farmhouses often featured low peon stains mounting stones by the door, a symbolic claim to minor gentry status. This social upheaval found expression in Scotland's emerging vernacular literature. Works like The Tale of Ralph Collier celebrated clever peasants outwitting their supposed superiors, while ballads about Robin Hood-like outlaws gained popularity. The once sharp line between noble and commoner began blurring, as impoverished minor nobles intermarried with wealthy peasant families. By the 15th century, Scotland stood transformed. While still a hierarchical society, the rigid feudal pyramid had developed cracks that would never fully heal. The peasant who could look his laird in the eye without flinching, who could negotiate terms rather than accept commands, who might even send a son to university. This was a new phenomenon that would shape Scotland's path to modernity. The transformation of Scotland's rural landscape in the late medieval period told its own story of social change, with the very earth bearing witness to shifting power dynamics between lords and peasants. Where once open fields had stretched uninterrupted under the watchful eyes of manorial overseers, now a patchwork of enclosed plots and independent farmsteads began emerging, each hedgerow and stone fence a silent declaration of peasant autonomy. This quiet revolution in land use patterns marked the beginning of the end for Scotland's feudal system. Enclosure movements took distinct forms across regions. In the fertile lowlands, prosperous peasants gradually consolidated their scattered strips into coherent fields, often pooling resources with neighbors to purchase dividing hedges. The traditional runrig system, where land was periodically redistributed to ensure fairness, gave way to more permanent arrangements as families secured hereditary leases. Stone boundary markers appeared where once only temporary furrows had separated plots, their permanence reflecting growing confidence in land tenure. The Highlands witnessed a different transformation. Clan chiefs, seeing traditional tribute systems collapse as peasants gained mobility, began converting communal grazing lands into private sheep runs. This early wave of clearance displaced many tenant families, foreshadowing the more brutal evictions of the 18th century. Yet even here, some astute clansmen negotiated unprecedented rights, the first written leases appearing in Gaelic, guaranteeing specific grazing privileges in exchange for military service when called. Agricultural innovations accompanied these structural changes. The heavy-wheeled plow, once restricted to lords' domains, became more common on peasant holdings as its productivity advantages became undeniable. Crop rotation systems, previously practiced only on monastic estates, began appearing on yeoman farms, with legumes alternating with grains to replenish nitrogen in the soil. Peat moss, long used only for fuel, was discovered to make excellent fertilizer when mixed with manure, boosting yields on marginal land. The peasant diet improved modestly but significantly. More reliable harvests meant fewer famine years, while the increased use of peas and beans provided much-needed protein. Herring from coastal villages became more widely available inland thanks to improved trade routes. Kitchen gardens now routinely contained onions, cabbages, and herbs, small luxuries that would have been unimaginable a century earlier. The first evidence of whiskey distillation in rural communities dates to this period, suggesting surplus grain was becoming available for non-essential purposes. Housing standards rose markedly. The traditional black house, with its central hearth and smoke-filled interior, began giving way to structures with proper chimneys and separate sleeping areas. Inventories from the 1400s list items like feather beds, wooden chairs, and even the occasional mirror in peasant homes, unthinkable luxuries before the plague. Improved thatching techniques made roofs more waterproof, while stone floors replaced beaten earth in wealthier households. This material progress came at a cultural cost. The close-knit communal life of medieval villages began fragmenting as families focused on their individual holdings. Traditional harvest festivals lost some of their communal character, becoming more private family celebrations. The old practice of boon work, where villagers would collectively help with major tasks like roof thatching, declined as paid labor became more common. Some churchmen lamented that peasants now preferred calculating profits to attending mass. Legal documents from the period reveal how thoroughly attitudes had changed. Peasant wills began specifying exact divisions of property among heirs rather than relying on customary inheritance patterns. Court cases show tenants suing landlords over grazing rights or disputed boundaries, something virtually unheard of in the early medieval period. Even the language of legal petitions changed, with peasants increasingly invoking ancient custom and rights rather than pleading for mercy. Education played an unexpected role in this transformation. The sons of prosperous peasants now occasionally attended grammar schools, often with church sponsorship. These literate young men returned to their villages able to read leases, challenge unfair taxes, and record local customs that had previously existed only in oral tradition. The first surviving peasant-written chronicles date from this period, simple farm journals noting weather, crop yields, and family events, but representing a revolutionary expansion of historical perspective. Women's lives saw particularly dramatic changes. With many men lost to warfare and migration, widows frequently managed farms and businesses independently. Town records show women operating breweries, weaving workshops, and even small merchant enterprises. The traditional spinning bee where women gathered to work and socialize evolved into more formal textile production networks. Some peasant women amassed surprising wealth. One 1453 will from Fife lists a farmer's widow leaving silver spoons, feather beds, and even a small library of religious books. The church struggled to adapt to these new realities. Monasteries that had relied on peasant labor found their traditional privileges challenged in court. Parish priests complained that their flocks were more interested in discussing crop prices than salvation. The growing availability of vernacular religious texts allowed literate peasants to develop spiritual ideas independent of clerical guidance, a development that would have profound consequences during the Reformation. By the dawn of the 16th century, Scotland stood on the cusp of modernity. The peasant who had once been little more than a serf bound to the land could now imagine a future where his children might attend university, own property, or even, in rare cases, marry into the lower nobility. The old feudal certainties had given way to a world of both greater opportunity and greater uncertainty, a world where a man's fate depended more on his wits and industry than on the accident of his birth. The late medieval period witnessed an extraordinary flourishing of peasant culture in Scotland, as newfound economic independence fueled creative expression that had long been suppressed under feudal constraints. What emerged was a vibrant tapestry of folk traditions, oral literature, and material arts that gave voice to centuries of silent struggle. This cultural awakening represented both a celebration of hard-won freedoms and a subtle resistance against lingering aristocratic dominance. Music became a particularly potent form of expression. The great Highland bagpipes, once restricted to clan ceremonies, now echoed through peasant weddings and harvest festivals. Fiddles crafted from local woods appeared in village taverns, their lively reels and strathspeys providing the soundtrack to a more confident peasantry. Song lyrics that would have been dangerously subversive a century earlier now circulated openly, ballads mocking greedy landlords or celebrating outlaw heroes like Rob Roy. Women developed intricate walking songs to accompany the fulling of cloth, their rhythms synchronizing work while their lyrics preserved ancient Gaelic poetry. Textile arts reached new heights as peasant women gained access to better materials. The distinctive tartan patterns we associate with Scottish clans today began as simple regional weaving variations before being codified by 16th century gentry. Flax cultivation expanded, allowing finer linen production alongside traditional wool. Some surviving examples from this period show astonishing skill. Intricate embroidery depicting biblical scenes mixed with older pagan motifs, a visual representation of Scotland's spiritual syncretism. The vernacular language blossomed as peasants began recording their world. While Latin remained a language of church and state, Scots, a cousin to English, became the medium for everyday poetry and prose. The first surviving peasant-authored works date to this era, farm account books that gradually evolved into personal journals, then into deliberate literary efforts. Humorous tales pitting clever peasants against dull-witted nobles became a popular genre, their satirical edge barely concealed beneath rustic humor. Material culture reflected changing values. Peasant homes began featuring decorated furniture, chests carved with geometric designs, stools with interwoven leather seats. The famous kist storage chest evolved from a simple functional object to a status symbol, often the most valuable item in a peasant household. Tableware showed similar refinement, with wooden trenchers giving way to pewter plates in wealthier homes. Even tools became objects of beauty, spinning wheels with intricate turnings, butter churns with carved handles. Seasonal festivals took on new significance as markers of cultural identity. The old Celtic fire festivals, Beltane, Lugnasad, Samhain, persisted alongside Christian holidays, creating a unique hybrid calendar. Halloween, derived from Samhain, became particularly elaborate, with peasants carving turnips into lanterns centuries before pumpkin carving became popular. These celebrations provided opportunities to invert social norms temporarily, with peasants dressing as lords and mocking aristocratic manners in sanctioned acts of social catharsis. Storytelling evolved from fireside entertainment to an art form. Professional scene-shade, storytellers, traveled between villages, their epic tales preserving clan histories and folk wisdom. Some peasant families began maintaining written genealogies, asserting their lineage's importance independent of noble approval. Ghost stories and fairy lore flourished, reflecting both lingering pre-Christian beliefs and creative responses to life's uncertainties. This cultural efflorescence had a dark underside, increasing stratification within peasant communities themselves. As some families prospered, others fell into debt and dependency. The Khadar class, landless laborers, grew substantially, their poverty contrasting sharply with yeoman farmers' relative comfort. Tensions emerged between traditional communal values and the new individualism, reflected in ballads lamenting the loss of village solidarity. The church's response to this peasant renaissance was ambivalent. While condemning superstitious folk practices, clergy also co-opted popular traditions, blessing fishing boats that had previously relied on pagan charms, or incorporating Celtic cross designs into church architecture. Some enlightened friars even collected peasant folklore, recognizing its cultural value even as they sought to Christianize it. By the 16th century, this peasant cultural confidence would help fuel Scotland's Reformation, as common people felt increasingly empowered to challenge religious as well as secular authority. The same independent spirit that produced beautiful music and poetry would soon turn to questioning church doctrine and translating the Bible into vernacular languages. In this sense, the late medieval peasant cultural revival laid essential groundwork for Scotland's journey into the modern era. The Protestant Reformation swept through 16th century Scotland like a cleansing fire, its flames fanned by decades of peasant discontent with a corrupt Catholic Church. What began as theological debate among scholars soon became a popular revolution, with common folk playing an unexpectedly decisive role in reshaping Scotland's spiritual landscape. This religious upheaval didn't merely alter Sunday rituals. It shattered centuries of tradition and redefined the relationship between Scots and their God. Peasants embraced Reformation ideas with surprising sophistication. Underground networks smuggled vernacular Bibles and Protestant pamphlets into rural areas, where literate villagers read them aloud at secret gatherings. The Catholic practice of Latin Mass had always been incomprehensible to most, but now fiery preachers like John Knox spoke in plain Scots about a faith where each person could approach God directly. This message resonated powerfully with farmers and craftsmen long exploited by a church that demanded tithes but offered little in return. The 1560 Scottish Reformation Parliament formalized the break with Rome, but the real transformation happened village by village. Peasant communities voted with their feet, abandoning parish churches where priests still preached popery, sometimes physically tearing down altars and statues themselves. Monasteries, long resented as landlords, saw their lands seized by enthusiastic mobs. The ruins of once great abbeys like Melrose and Jedburgh became stone quarries for peasant homes, their carved saints' faces now supporting cottage roof beams. This religious revolution carried profound social implications. The Protestant emphasis on literacy led to a surge in village schooling, as peasants demanded education to read scripture for themselves. The old church's Saints' Day holidays gave way to simpler Sabbath observance, though many folk customs stubbornly persisted. Perhaps most radically, the Reformation challenged the divine right of kings, a notion that would have earth-shaking consequences in later centuries. Peasant women found unexpected opportunities in this new religious order. Protestantism's rejection of clerical celibacy created a demand for ministers' wives, educated women who could model godly domesticity. Some peasant daughters, taught to read by reform-minded parents, became formidable Bible scholars in their own right. The old Catholic ideal of female monastic life faded, replaced by a Protestant vision of womanhood that valued household management and child-rearing as sacred callings. Material culture reflected these changes. The colorful religious art that had adorned Catholic churches vanished, replaced by whitewashed walls and simple wooden communion tables. In peasant homes, the Catholic holy water stoup by the door gave way to a family Bible on the table. Even names changed. Children were less often named after saints and more frequently called Old Testament names like David, Rachel, or Samuel. Yet the Reformation's promise often outpaced its reality. While the new Kirk, Church of Scotland, preached equality before God, social hierarchies proved harder to dismantle. Peasants still owed tithes, now to Protestant ministers rather than Catholic priests. The Sabbath became even more strictly enforced than before, with Kirk sessions punishing those who worked or played on Sundays. Some peasants grumbled that they had exchanged one set of masters for another. The Reformation also accelerated the decline of Gaelic culture. Protestantism came dressed in Lowland Scots and English, its preachers viewing Highland traditions with suspicion. The old Celtic Christianity that had blended pagan and Catholic elements found no place in Knox's rigorous Calvinism. This cultural divide would deepen over centuries, contributing to the Highland-Lowland split that still marks Scotland today. By century's end, Scotland had been transformed. The peasant who had once crossed himself when passing a roadside shrine now sang psalms in the vernacular. The thatched cottage that had housed a crucifix now displayed biblical verses on its walls. The medieval world of saints and sacraments had given way to something new, a Scotland where every plowman saw himself as a priest in his own right, accountable directly to God rather than through ecclesiastical intermediaries. The Reformation's seismic waves had barely settled when Scotland's peasantry faced a new challenge that would test their resilience to the utmost. The brutal period known as the Killing Times in the late 17th century. As religious and political factions clashed violently across the country, ordinary farming families found themselves caught in the crossfire of a struggle that pitted Presbyterian Covenanters against the episcopal establishment and royal authority. What began as a dispute over church governance soon descended into a bloody conflict where peasant homes became secret meeting places and barley fields turned into outdoor cathedrals. In the lowlands particularly, peasant communities became the backbone of the Covenanter movement. Farmers who had barely ventured beyond their parishes now risked everything to attend illegal conventicles, outdoor prayer meetings held in remote glens or at night in barns. The famous blue blanket that signaled these gatherings was often a peasant woman's plaid spread on hillside rocks. When government dragoons came searching, entire villages would engage in elaborate deceptions. Women hid Bibles in their underskirts, children memorized lookout routes, and old men feigned deafness to avoid betraying ministers. The peasants' intimate knowledge of the land proved invaluable. Preachers' caves dotted the countryside, hidden hollows where traveling ministers could take shelter, often provisioned by local families with food and dry straw. Some caves had ingenious warning systems of strategically placed stones that would clatter when disturbed. Farmers developed sophisticated signaling methods. The particular way a plow was left in a field or laundry hung on a line could convey messages about troop movements. Persecution bred remarkable courage. Peasant women like Margaret Wilson famously faced drowning rather than renounce their faith. Others, like the farmer Andrew Hislop, went to the gallows for harboring ministers. The infamous boot, torture device, crushed legs, and the thumbkins mutilated hands, yet many refused to betray their fellow believers. These stories became legendary, passed down through generations as the psalm-singing martyrs entered folk memory. Material culture adapted to repression. Tiny Bible boxes, with false bottoms became common household items. Elaborate heckle pins, used for flax processing, hid miniature communion cups. Some families sewed pages of scripture into children's clothing linings. The famous Covenanter's sword was often just a peasant's sickle or scythe hastily repurposed when dragoons appeared. This period also saw the flowering of Scottish psalmody as a form of resistance. Peasants who couldn't read could memorize the metrical psalms, allowing entire congregations to sing the word when books were unavailable. Distinctive Scottish psalm tunes like Martyrs and Dundee became musical signatures of the underground church. Some melodies were deliberately set in unusual keys so they could be identified from a distance. The persecution ultimately failed because it underestimated peasant networks. Market days became cover for information exchange, with women trading eggs while passing coded messages. Peddlers doubled as couriers, hiding letters in bundles of wool. Even the humble shepherd's whistle became a communication tool, with specific calls warning of approaching danger. By the 1690s, the tide began turning. The Glorious Revolution brought limited toleration, though tensions simmered well into the next century. For Scotland's peasants, the Covenanting struggle left complex legacies. It deepened literacy as families studied smuggled Bibles, but also bred suspicion of centralized authority. It fostered egalitarian ideals while sometimes dividing communities between conformists and hill folk. Most importantly, it proved the peasantry's capacity for organized resistance, a lesson that would echo in later struggles for political reform. The Killing Times demonstrated how thoroughly Reformation ideas had taken root in Scotland's soil. What began as a theological dispute had become a popular movement sustained by peasant courage and ingenuity. When royal authority challenged their right to worship, these humble plowmen and milkmaids responded with a quiet defiance that changed the course of Scottish history. As Scotland staggered into the 18th century, its peasantry faced perhaps their greatest challenge yet: the brutal transformation from medieval farming communities to a modern rural economy through the waves of Highland clearances and agricultural improvements. What the wars of independence and Reformation had begun, the Enlightenment would complete. A fundamental reordering of Scottish rural life that left no aspect of peasant existence untouched. The same fields that had sustained generations now became battlegrounds in a quiet revolution as profound as any armed conflict. The process began deceptively slowly. Improving landlords, inspired by new agricultural theories from Europe, started consolidating small peasant holdings into larger, more efficient farms. Traditional runrig systems gave way to enclosed fields with neat stone walls, beautiful to look at, but devastating to communal farming practices. Crofters who had worked the land for generations found their leases abruptly terminated, replaced by sheep that required fewer workers but yielded higher profits. The first evictions were often polite affairs compared to what would follow. A notice slipped under the door, a curt conversation with the factor, land agent. Then the heart-wrenching sight of a family dismantling their home stone by stone. The Highlands suffered most catastrophically. Clan chiefs, once paternalistic protectors of their people, now embraced their new role as capitalist landlords. The aftermath of the failed 1745 Jacobite rebellion provided perfect cover for dismantling traditional Gaelic society. Entire glens were emptied with military precision. Thatched roofs set ablaze to prevent return. Elderly residents carried out on doors when they refused to leave, wailing women clutching handfuls of hearth ashes as mementos. The notorious Sutherland clearances saw some 15,000 Highlanders forcibly relocated to coastal crofting townships, where they were expected to take up fishing, an alien skill to inland farming communities. Lowland peasants faced less violent, but equally disruptive changes. The Scottish version of Enclosure Acts abolished common lands where villagers had grazed livestock for centuries. Suddenly, gathering firewood or hunting rabbits became trespassing offenses punishable by transportation. The introduction of potato cultivation temporarily improved food security, but also tied peasants more tightly to small plots of marginal land. Rural populations became increasingly stratified. A lucky few became prosperous tenant farmers, while the majority sank into precarious day labor or migrated to growing industrial cities. Peasant resistance took many forms. Some Highlanders sabotaged sheep enclosures under cover of darkness or attacked factors' homes. More commonly, entire communities engaged in legal delaying tactics, disputing surveys, refusing to sign documents, or exploiting every loophole in the complex tangle of Scottish land law. The famous Battle of the Braes in 1882 saw Skye crofters physically resisting eviction in one of the last gasps of organized resistance, but by then the clearances had largely achieved their goals. The material culture of rural Scotland transformed under these pressures. Traditional black houses gave way to whitewashed cottages with proper chimneys, not necessarily because peasants wanted them, but because landlords imposed improved housing standards. The once ubiquitous hand quern, grain grinder, disappeared as landlords required tenants to use their toll mills. Even clothing styles changed under economic pressure, the belted plaid evolving into the modern kilt as landlords discouraged savage Gaelic dress. Yet peasant ingenuity persisted. Clever adaptations like lazy beds, raised garden plots fertilized with seaweed, allowed marginal land to remain productive. The illicit whiskey trade flourished as displaced Highlanders turned their distilling skills to profit. Women developed new textile industries like paisley shawl weaving to supplement family incomes. The old communal spirit found expression in farming societies, where peasants pooled resources to purchase seed or livestock. The clearances also sparked an unexpected cultural renaissance. As Gaelic communities disintegrated, a new appreciation emerged for their traditions. Peasant songs and stories collected by folklorists like Alexander Carmichael became treasured national artifacts. The very tartans that landlords had discouraged were now romanticized as symbols of Scottish identity. This nostalgia couldn't reverse the economic forces at work, but it did help preserve elements of peasant culture that might otherwise have vanished completely. By the early 19th century, Scotland's rural landscape had been utterly transformed. What had been a patchwork of peasant farms was now a polarized countryside of large commercial estates and tiny crofts. The medieval peasant's intimate relationship with the land, for all its hardships, had given way to a precarious tenancy system where one bad harvest could mean ruin. Yet even in this new world, echoes of older ways persisted. The stubborn independence that had sustained Scottish peasants through centuries of famine, warfare, and persecution now found expression in cooperative movements and early trade unions. The final irony? Many improvements pushed by Enlightenment thinkers actually decreased agricultural productivity in the long term. The traditional runrig system, for all its apparent inefficiency, had been finally adapted to Scotland's difficult climate and terrain. Modern archaeology reveals that some cleared villages stood on land that had been continuously farmed for over 1,000 years, a testament to the sophisticated ecological knowledge of medieval peasants that their enlightened successors failed to appreciate. As the 19th century waned, Scotland's medieval peasantry faded into history, their centuries of struggle and resilience leaving an indelible mark on the national character. What emerged from the crucible of clearance and industrialization was a new Scottish identity, one that romanticized the very rural life it had destroyed, while building upon the peasant foundations of thrift, education, and communal solidarity. The final chapters of this story reveal how the values forged in medieval crofts and farmsteads would shape modern Scotland in unexpected ways. The peasant exodus created Scotland's urban working class. Displaced Highlanders became the miners of Lanarkshire and the dockworkers of Glasgow. Lowland farm laborers transformed into jute mill workers in Dundee and linen weavers in Paisley. They brought with them village traditions. Communal baking became factory lunch clubs. Harvest festivals morphed into trade union picnics. The strict Sabbath observance of rural Scotland persisted in industrial cities, as did the peasant emphasis on education. Glasgow's 19th century literacy rates astonished visitors. Scotland's educational advantage owes much to its peasant past. The Reformation's emphasis on Bible reading had created a culture of literacy that survived even the harshest clearances. Medieval peasant families who scraped together pennies for a child's schooling became Victorian mill workers sacrificing to send sons to university. This upward mobility through education became known as the lad o' parts tradition, the bright peasant boy rising through merit rather than birth. Many of Scotland's Enlightenment thinkers and industrial innovators came from humble rural origins. The Scottish diaspora carried peasant values worldwide. Clearance victims who immigrated to Canada, Australia, and America took with them a distinct set of attitudes: suspicion of landlordism, respect for learning, and a fierce work ethic. Nova Scotia's Gaelic communities preserved songs and stories that had disappeared from Scotland itself. The log cabin construction technique used by American pioneers derived from Scottish crofters' building methods. Even the American public school system shows traces of Scottish peasant educational ideals. Modern Scotland's relationship with its peasant past remains deeply ambivalent. The same nation that erected monuments to cleared villages also embraced the agricultural improvements that destroyed them. Heritage centers meticulously reconstruct medieval black houses while their living descendants sit in central heated homes. The once despised Gaelic language now receives government protection, though few fluent speakers remain. This tension between preservation and progress defines much of contemporary Scottish culture. Yet the medieval peasant legacy endures in subtler ways. Scotland's strong communitarian spirit, evident in everything from universal health care to community land buyouts, echoes the mutual aid practices of ancient townships. The continued popularity of folk music and traditional dance maintains cultural continuity across the centuries. Even the worldwide fascination with Scottish clan heritage traces back to peasant genealogists who painstakingly preserved family histories through oral tradition. The greatest tribute to Scotland's medieval peasants may be the very survival of their stories. What began as oral tales around smoky hearths eventually filled history books and museum displays. The anonymous millions who endured famine, plague, and oppression now have their experiences recognized as fundamental to Scotland's development. Their unmarked graves may be lost, but their values shaped a nation. As we reflect on this journey from medieval hardship to modern memory, we're reminded that history's true measure lies not in castles or crown jewels, but in the quiet courage of ordinary people. The peasant who bent his back to the plow, the mother who sang lullabies in a leaky black house, the child who learned letters by firelight, these were the true builders of Scotland. Their legacy isn't frozen in nostalgia, but lives on in the resilience, creativity, and fierce independence that still define the Scottish character today.